Hello, my name is Andrew Keane. Welcome to Keane on America, the daily show about everything that matters, with the world's leading commentators and thinkers. Hello, everybody. As our year is rapidly ending, what does the data tell us? And what might it promise for next year, for 2026? To do that, I invited a data scientist onto the show. Andrea Jones-Rooy is a podcaster, writer, former professor at NYU. So to begin our conversation with Andrea, I asked her what the data tells us about all the stuff we're obsessed with: healthcare, immigration, divisions in America. What it tells us about what really happened in 2025.
And I can't think of a better way to wrap up the year than to talk about data, but I'm a bit biased in that assessment. You know, I'm excited that you brought up all those different types of divisions because the data is quite mixed depending on what sort of division we talk about. But the answer for pretty much all of them is it's not really the way that we talk about it. So, for example, most of my time I think about political divisions, and we are divided politically in the sense that people on the left in the US, which usually are Democrats, and people on the right, which almost always are Republicans, we don't like each other. We don't trust each other. We accuse the other side of being closed-minded, hypocrites. Both sides say this to the other side. But if you actually break down many of the important issues, Americans are not that divided. If you ask sort of separate from charged partisan sort of language, if you just say, hey, what is your stance on immigration? What is your stance of the role of church in schools? What do you think should happen with X, Y, and Z policy? Most Americans are actually in the middle. We just assign these labels to us that the minute you hear that label or you hear a certain name, then we are charged emotionally. A lot of researchers call it affective polarization. So we're divided, but we're more divided on emotion than we are actually.
Andrea, whenever anyone brings up the data on my show, and I don't mean this as a critique of you as a data scientist, but
it's all right. Bring it on.
A light bulb always goes off in my head. I hope I've still got some light bulbs in my head, suggesting that if someone says the data proves this or that, it usually means that it doesn't, or it usually means that they're not entirely convinced. And of course, my assumption is that somebody can always find data to make any argument. Is that a fair observation?
It is a fair observation. And in fact, I generally try to steer away, both in my own speaking and when I was teaching, I would advise students on this, is we don't really like to say things like the data says or the data proves. I prefer language like you can see from the data or there are trends consistent with. I'm not always perfect about that myself because you're absolutely right. We can confirmation bias our way through a lot of things. And that can look like just cherry picking pieces of data that are consistent with the story we're trying to tell or that we're trying to persuade people on. It can also mean ignoring pockets of data or being more critical of that data than perhaps we fairly should. That's not the same thing, however, as saying there is no truth or there's no way to know everything, let's throw it all out. Generally speaking, and this is not great in a world where we have breaking news and headlines and push alerts and attention spans that aren't particularly famously long. But in general, when we're trying to say, what can we learn from data about anything, whether it's politics or climate or social issues or medicine or whatever, is it takes a long time. And it takes a lot of research, and it takes a lot of researchers, whether they're formal academic scientists or in a lab or in a company, all hammering away at the same problem and asking again and again and again and again, what are we missing? What are some other ways to look at this? So, for example, the data on polarization, I just summarized what is probably about 30 years now of researchers saying, gosh, we feel polarized. Are we polarized? How many different ways can we look at this? And it was decades before anyone said, oh, maybe it's the emotions more than the issues themselves. And so you're absolutely right. I think we've done a disservice as data scientists, as quantitative people, giving the impression that data is irrefutable. I think that is a faulty way to go about talking about this stuff.
And one of the pieces you wrote, intriguingly, was that we don't actually disagree, and you just suggested this. We just dislike each other. Maybe that's what the data tells us.
Well, we can
Andrea,
learn that. I think the overall story that's more compelling from the data we have is that it's much more about dislike than about disagreement.
so
But I
that's what
wouldn't
the
say
data.
yeah.
So the data tells us that we actually dislike each other personally, as opposed to disagreeing. Whereas the common assumption is that we like each other when we talk in a room, when we don't know what the other person's saying, even if we disagree. So you would turn that assumption on its head.
Well, it turns out that if you put a bunch of people in a room, and this is increasingly difficult to do because one of the other things that we're finding in the research on this is that while our views are not necessarily further apart, it is the case that it used to be such that I might be a person who's largely on the left, but I hold some conservative views, and someone who's largely on the right might hold some liberal views. It's less likely now that we have that kind of crossover. So while we're not necessarily on balance more extreme when it comes to abortion or immigration or government spending or you name it, guns, etc., it is the case that we're less likely to have points of commonality. And so I go into that to say that if we do say we put 20 people in a room and we say, okay, talk about American politics, even if I don't know what someone's views are, you haven't come in with a big like donkey on a button or a, pro-Obama sticker or anything like that. The minute you announce your views on the Second Amendment, the minute you announce your views on abortion, I, at least in the United States, will very quickly make a strong assumption that your views are therefore different from mine on every other issue we might talk about. And so if you're in a very kind of carefully constructed environment where you're mostly talking about things that aren't politics, we're all going to get along just fine. The challenge now is that once you find out where someone stands on one thing, it's very easy and you're almost always going to be correct in terms of when it comes to how they land on everything else. And that's when we all get angry again. So if there is a way, and there are facilitators who do this, I've actually been talking with someone who's using AI facilitators. AI has lots of problems, but one promising area is an AI facilitator that actually brings people from different sides to talk about the issues in a non-charged way. Once we can get our identities out of the way, we can actually have constructive conversations. But so it's hard to move that emotional piece out of it.
Speaking of AI, of course, it's one of the issues that people most distrust. And if you had two people in a room, perhaps a Bernie Sanders leftist or quote unquote leftist and a Steve Bannon, Marjorie Taylor Greene style conservative, they would actually agree in some ways on more than they would disagree, especially when it comes to the threat of big tech and the role of American capitalism. So the left-right axis doesn't really work anymore, does it?
It can work on certain issues, but you're absolutely right to challenge it. So we've definitely oversimplified it into saying, oh, I'm on the left, I'm on the right. Originally, that left-right was really much more about economics and how much we should see the government involved in spending versus not. And that used to largely represent the left-right. And I don't know if you remember, but I had to be reminded that back in, the distant past of, say, 2008, when Obama was running for the first time, there was a lot of talk of like, well, I'm fiscally conservative, but I'm socially liberal. And we at least had two axes back then. And even then we said, well, that's obviously not enough. There's more axes than that. So you're right. I think the left-right axis, it's a convenient one. It's one that is useful for a lot of, shorthand discussions, but it certainly doesn't capture the full range of beliefs that we might have. And in fact, that's exactly part of the issue, is that it used to be the case that I might have a lot of commonalities with someone, say, economically, but maybe not socially, but we could at least agree on economics. Right now, what we're seeing that divide in terms of, we're not further apart, but we have less of like kind of a mesh. Like, where are the fiscally conservative Democrats? We don't hear from as much. And the socially liberal Republicans, we don't hear from as much. Like, those were the people who kind of held the conversations together.
Perhaps
and there's certainly more dimensions than that.
They're playing bridge in their country clubs.
That could be.
Andrea, what does the data tell us on the T word, on trust? I mean, again, one of the common assumptions is that the trust barometer, which gets issued every year by my friends at the Edelman PR company, is always going down. One wonders whether it'll ever get below zero, because it must be hovering just above it at the moment. Does the data tell us that nobody trusts anything or anyone anymore? And what implications does that have to a data scientist like yourself, who's always wanting to get behind the data? Who's going to trust you? Why should anyone trust Andrea Jones-Rooy any more than anyone else?
I think you're asking a couple of very good questions. And my hope is that nobody, for me anyway, no one should have to trust me. One of the things that I'm perpetually working on is trying to convince other people that they too can look at the data directly and draw their own conclusions. And I mean that in a real rigorous way, not in a quote, I did my own research and therefore confirmation biased my way to the conclusion I started out with. But I genuinely don't think that we should be relying on trust when it comes to making sense of, say, scientific research, making sense of trends in data. I think that we are all perfectly capable of learning how to be literate and how to read those things and say, oh, okay, this is the claim, but do I see data, and really make a good faith effort to try to get to the bottom of it. That might be wishful thinking, because a lot of times, we're not all going to sit down and go back into the original source data, and we also don't have time for it. So that does bring us to the value of trust in a society. And for a long time, we used to see much more trust, as you said. And what do we mean by trust? Well, we mean a couple of things, and the trend looks a little different depending on how you define it. But if you some of the common ways that it's asked are things like, if you think about trust in government, you think one of the questions is something like, I believe that the people in power in Washington ultimately want to do the right thing for American people, or they ultimately want to do the right thing for the country. And that number has just been plummeting. But we do see trust, in terms of what we call in political science, what we call elite cues. So who I'm turning to for information. But we've seen a transfer of that trust away from people like political leaders to, say, podcasters like Joe Rogan, or television, op-ed news personalities, people like that. And so it's not that people aren't trusting per se. It's that we're changing who we're trusting, and we're trusting different people. And the one maybe indicator that people on the left and people on the right, or people on the whatever axes and dimensions you want to think about politically, Americans generally, we agree on our decreasing trust in formal traditional government. But that doesn't mean we don't have trust in other things. But back to my original point, I don't know that I would like there to be some trust. It kind of makes life easier. But if we're not going to trust, then I say let's at least make sure that we're informed and not just drawing whatever conclusion we want.
I don't want to turn this into just another boring conversation on Donald Trump. But it strikes me, given what you've said about people no longer trusting politicians, Trump seems to have done everything, or does everything he can, to convince people that he isn't a politician. Everything that comes out of his mouth is either against politics, other politicians, even within his own party or supposed party. And he's defining himself as the Joe Rogan of American politics. So does the data tell us that the most trusted people are the most rebellious, the Joe Rogans, the Donald Trumps of the world, the Steve Bannons, and on the left, the others who question the very system that we all live in?
I mean, I do think that there's a lot to be said about the power of outsider views at this point. I think people on the left and the right, at least in the last, in, let's say, this decade, but perhaps going back further, all pretty much agree that the system feels like it's not working. I think one of the things that was a strength, I don't know the specific numbers behind this. I don't do, I can't speak to the actual kind of campaign numbers, but I can tell you that there's a ton of research about emotion and politics, and some of the things that make us most likely to pay attention to politics, which campaigns are going to keep track of. So what gets us to click on a link when they're asking for money, what gets us to watch a political ad all the way through rather than scroll to something else, is an appeal to emotions. So things like fear and things like anger are much more likely to get any candidate political traction, or any person who's not a candidate, someone who's a podcaster. You're going to get someone to listen to your thing if you're going to say, hey, here's what we're outraged about. Here's why you should be afraid for your children.
Maybe we should be more outraged, Andrea, in this conversation. That's why we have such bad audiences. Good audiences, but not Joe Rogan style. You've done a lot of work on immigration, which is another huge issue, enormously divisive and controversial. You wrote something on the preamble, one of Substack's most popular publications, on 8 charts that explain the immigration debate. What did you find that surprises us? What data would surprise us on immigration? Do we agree or disagree more than we think?
Well, I will say that there in general, it is in the category of, most Americans think there should be some kind of border control. Maybe getting into the specifics, you start to see some divergence, but in general, it's very rare that you're going to see. So most sides are mostly told caricatures of the other side. On the left, people are told everyone on the right wants to kick out all foreigners except for Norwegians. And on the left, people are told, or on the right, people are told that everyone on the left wants to let everybody in, even if they're criminals and they can bring their drugs and their guns and all of those things. And neither of those things are true. And we kind of know that, but you wouldn't know it from just literal readings of a lot of the partisan, social media and traditional media that we consume. And so, so most Americans, and we spend a lot more time arguing about how stupid the other side is than actually talking about, well, what would a solution look like? What would a fair system look like? And there are people having those conversations, but they tend not to make it to the top of our algorithms. But the other thing that when I was digging into it, that was surprising to me, and maybe you know more about this than I do, but I was very surprised the number and the percentage of immigrants into the United States in the last few years, at least, and largely historically, who are illegal is quite a bit smaller than the numbers than I thought they would be going into this particular research project. So I don't have a history of studying immigration. It was something where we wanted to get some numbers and kind of get our heads around what was going on. And I personally was surprised because we talk about it so much that it's actually a very, very, very small percentage of the overall immigrant population that is illegal. And then the other surprising thing to me as a non-legal expert is that it's not necessarily obvious what counts as illegal. There are many people in this country right now who came legally, but then overstayed a visa or are in a kind of gray zone of waiting for a visa. And so whether or not we categorize those folks as illegal has ramifications for what those numbers look like. And so the actual numbers are both smaller and kind of harder to define than I think a lot of the discourse points us to.
Yeah, I was looking at your charts and your numbers. It didn't surprise me because I've always got the sense that especially when it comes to immigration, Trump goes out of his way to appear cruel and to get pleasure out of punishing, revenging people who are in this country without the right papers. And whereas previous Democratic presidents, in particular Obama and Biden, go out of their way to suggest that they're much more humane. But the reality when it comes to punishment, border policy, is they're not actually that different.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all performative, this thing.
It's very performative. There were a lot of deportations under Obama. There were quite a few under Biden. A lot of the people, when you point to the numbers that the Trump administration does of the increase in air quotes, illegal immigration under the Biden administration, a lot of that increase was due to legal programs in place to bring in folks from Afghanistan and other kind of political refugees that maybe since have stayed and then it becomes illegal, but they weren't illegal at the time. And so the numbers, exactly, the trends and the numbers really are more similar than they are different over these administrations when you compare them to the type of rhetoric that's used. So I definitely would say that you're right to separate kind of how we talk about this from what's actually happening on the ground. That said, it's not to say that there can't be harms from how we talk about these things.
Yeah, I'm certainly the last person to defend what ICE or Trump is doing. But what would a data scientist like yourself tell us about the culture of retribution and violence that Trump seems to boast about? What does that suggest to you as a data scientist? Is that beyond data? Your podcast is called Behind the Data.
Yeah.
But it seems to be a long way behind the data. Can the data help us explain this, at least in my mind, rather bizarre phenomenon of enjoying revenge and violence and getting pleasure out of it and boasting about it?
I mean, one of my favorite areas of application of data to kind of social and political questions is at this. I like that you've identified this area because this area of, say, violent rhetoric, of a culture of revenge, of kind of hate and fear mongering, things like that, or othering of the other side, or othering of immigrants, all of that stuff. that kind of stuff doesn't seem like it would readily lend itself to data, but there's really interesting work, and it has been going on for a decade or two around kind of quantifying and understanding both trends in political violence. And so before we had things like AI and really advanced natural language processing that literally looked like, okay, what words are people on the left versus people on the right using to describe immigrants and refugees? And as those words change, can we say something about how these people are treated? If you call them illegals or aliens versus, asylum seekers or something like that. But now we have much more sophisticated tools. So it's less challenging now to map and understand trends in violent language. It is difficult, not impossible, but very difficult to say, well, what is the consequence of that? Is it the case that candidates using more violent language, or political leaders using more violent language, or even people on TV or in podcasts using more violent language, does that translate to violence or a tolerance of violence out there in the world? And kind of the obvious feeling is like, yeah, why wouldn't it? But then you think about other pieces of data around, do violent video games cause people to be more violent in real life? And starting to tease out causal relationship with observational data can be really, really challenging. Though in general, I think the tentative findings are that it's not good. It's not good.
Yeah, I mean,
when we talk about the other side.
And it seems to bring it out everybody's worst qualities. Although I wonder, Trump has been a lifelong fan of the sport, if it is indeed a sport of wrestling, which is all fake violence and fake competition. So I wonder whether that fakery, now he's brought that wrestling culture to politics. And again, I'm not sure how the data can or can't help us if the world itself has become one big wrestling contest.
I mean, I think that's where I both have some hope for data, but I think there's a lot of responsibility for people like me and people who like you, who kind of care about understanding reality, which is, we can have all the data that we want in the world that says we actually don't disagree, we just dislike each other, we actually don't hate people, we actually just think this. But if we're not able to communicate that to folks, or if people aren't interested in the truth or what's closest to the truth that we think we can learn from the data that we have, and that kind of caveating doesn't help with the messaging at all, but I think it's important. I think it doesn't matter how much data we have if people don't want to hear it. One of the things that I believe is a departure from kind of politics as we've done them in the United States for several decades is the extent to which not just that Trump is turning things into like a wrestling match in politics, but there's a very specific quickness, and this is new enough that we don't have robust data on this, but there's a very quick a tendency in him to blame the other side anytime anything goes wrong. And I think if you did a content analysis or kind of like a natural language processing sort of piece of work on presidential rhetoric, you would see that the blame game of political enemies is something that even we didn't see in Trump 1.0, that in Trump 2.0 is really taken off. And I would say that that's going to make this whole we hate the other side even worse than it already is.
Andrea, you've done a lot of work also comparing America with the rest of the world in data terms. You've looked at its healthcare system. Most people assume that the American healthcare system is more dysfunctional, more expensive, more wasteful than anywhere else in the world. Is that confirmed with the data? What's your research? What's your data analysis on the American healthcare system and how broken it actually is and what people actually think of it?
Well, so I will say that make no mistake, there are a lot of problems with the American healthcare system. I spent a bit of time digging specifically into the price of prescription drugs in the United States. So I'm not speaking to the broader sort of insurance being tied to your employer and all of that, which is its own mess. But it is the case, and this is something that actually has a lot of bipartisan traction, where on balance, if you just look at the overall averages, it is the case that Americans pay about 3 times as much on average for prescription drugs compared to other people in developed economies or in developed democracies. So, OECD countries, UK, EU, Canada, Australia, all the countries you're thinking of. But if you actually dig down even just one level lower, and this graph that you have here shows this exactly, is that actually it's the 3 times is an average, but the underlying distribution is very unbalanced. So we actually pay less for generic medications than, say, our peers in Canada and UK and so on. We pay much less for generics, and generics make up something like 90% of our prescriptions. So for most drugs, when I just go to the store and fork over money for a drug, I'm actually paying less than OECD countries. The difference, however, is for a very small percentage of brand name original drugs. Many of them are biologics, so they're made out of stem cells, mRNA, things like that. Not all of them. It's the branded drugs that cost 10 times more, way more. And so the reason we end up on this 3x number is because we have a few drugs that cost a ton and a lot of drugs that actually cost way less. And so I think it's important to clarify this. And I do think, too, that as a data scientist, you often end up being the person at the dinner party who's like, well, actually, but getting that kind of clarity helps us think about what the problem is. The problem is not most drugs are more expensive. The problem from the United States perspective is that some drugs are astronomically more expensive. And then you can ask yourself questions like, well, why is that? Should that be the case? How might we change that? And that starts to send us down a rabbit hole of like, well, a lot of drug innovations happen in the United States, but we also have a lot of patent misuse. And we also have these kind of weird third parties that a lot of other countries don't have. Other governments do negotiating on behalf of the people. So you end up pulling out all these different players, specifically just within pharmaceutical drugs. But then you can kind of get into some answers. So, okay, we think that branded drugs, it's okay that they're a little more expensive because someone took on a risk to develop them and it was difficult and it's for a disease that we couldn't cure and now we can, and that's amazing. And so they're a little more expensive. We might be okay with all of that. And then if we are, then it needs to be okay that they're a little bit more expensive in the United States until we say, well, what about the patent situation? Why are we not seeing these patents expire? Are these companies maliciously taking advantage of what's called patent thickets, where you kind of have, 25 patents for a single innovation as opposed to just one patent? And so it sends you down this rabbit hole of kind of deeper questions specifically about a very narrow class of drugs, which then brings up very broad ethical questions, which is if I'm someone with a super rare disease and someone comes out with a drug that costs $1 million a pill, that's both really, really bad because a lot of people can't get it, but it's also potentially truly life-saving for the people who can. So you end up in this sort of broad ethical situation as well. So I don't have a good answer for this, but I think it was revealing, or at least I hope it was useful for people to see that it's not just that your average prescription pill, antibiotics is 3 times that it is everywhere else, even though that's the main talking point.
So, Andrea, we've dealt with divisions, healthcare, immigration. What other interesting data points do we have about 2025 as we move towards the end of the year? I know you've done some interesting research on religion, about how America is different from the rest of the world on that front too.
Yeah, so we are kind of in a strange middle ground when it comes to religion in the United States. And some of it depends on how you define religion. So and maybe I'll just ask you, do you consider yourself a religious person?
Definitely not.
No, me neither. If you ask most people in the United States, or about 50% of Americans would have an answer roughly like yours, which is like, no. Some of those people in the definitely not category are still vaguely, say, Christian or vaguely part of some other tradition. Some of us are atheists, some of us are agnostic, but there's still a decent chunk of Americans. And again, depending on how you measure it, it's about half of Americans, a little more, a little less, depending on the strictness or the intensity of the threshold for religious. But about half of Americans are religious in some form or another. And this formal religion, as opposed to spiritual or something like that. This is much more than most people in other developed democracies. So again, the kind of Europe, Canada, Australia, Japan, Americans are much more religious compared to let's say our peer countries politically and economically than the rest of the world. We are far less religious than the vast majority of, say, the global South, a lot of Asia, a lot of Africa. And so we occupy this strange middle ground. And so I was curious, why don't we look more like the other countries, our neighbor Canada, and why aren't we as religious as a bunch of other countries? Why are we sort of religious? And the answer, as far as I was able to find, and there's been a lot, decades of research on this, but the answer is this kind of interesting story. The one that I found most compelling is this interesting story about how the United States began, which was we initially started as a country that very much deliberately separated church and state. And that meant that the churches were free to operate kind of like businesses where they could recruit. There's a nice language where it's a marketplace for souls. So churches in the United States were very capitalistic in this way, where they went around and said, okay, how can I appeal to the most people? How can I recruit people to my church? Whereas in other countries, for example, in Europe, where a lot of the people from the United States came from, the church was kind of just in the center of town and it was part of a way of life. So they didn't have to like adapt or be appealing in any sort of way, market themselves. So churches kind of hit the ground running in the United States as this sort of, let me appeal to the most people and outcompete other churches. And part of this meant that if I was in a church in the United States and I didn't like it, in other countries where there was just sort of like one Catholic church, my choice was either stay or leave the church altogether. Whereas in the United States, if I'm in one particular church or one particular faith, I say, I don't love this. I can just go across the street to a different church. Like churches are like Starbucks in the United States in that way. And then the third piece of the puzzle is that the United States was specifically settled by people seeking a place where they could practice their religion freely. I think we often conflate the fact that we began with the separation of church and state as saying, okay, that's because church isn't important. The separation of church and state was because church was very important. So out of the gates, we just set ourselves up for a country where church would actually play a much more active role in our lives, as opposed to places where the church is sort of ceremoniously more central, but doesn't actually kind of get involved in our lives in that way. And if you think about it, even today, the church for a lot of people is a source of great community. It's a source of friends. It's a social network. It's a place where you do economic networking. And so the church is really a center of community in the United States in a way that it really didn't end up being in a lot of other
this
countries.
idea of the marketplace of souls has actually quite literally come true. I want to get briefly to your predictions, your data-driven predictions, Andrea, for 2026. But before we get there, can data scientists tell us anything about relative misery? A lot of people, when they're asked about 2025, will reply that this was the year of misery, of anxiety, where no one seems to be happy anymore. What does the data science tell us about that in 2025?
I mean, I'm going to sound like a broken record because a lot of these questions, the answer is something like, well, it depends on what you mean by misery and what you mean by happiness. And a very unpopular view, which I think is relevant to why we all feel so miserable, a very unpopular view among a lot of the quantitative research on happiness is that things are great. If you think about things like health outcomes, longevity, conflict, the percentage of the world, not just the United States, the percentage of the world that is living under relative stability, is relatively well off, has enough to eat, has enough shelter, would suggest that we don't have anything to complain about. Just saying that is going to get me canceled in a lot of circles because you can immediately spring to mind all of these terrible injustices. Of course, there's conflict. Of course, there's famine. Of course, there's disease. Of course, there's violence. And so if you say misery in terms of how I personally feel in my life or how I feel the world is going or is the world headed in a way that is good, if you kind of move away from the more, I don't even want to say material, but sort of the more tangible measures of how well off someone is and move to the more internal experiences, we are more miserable. There is more anxiety. There is more misery. It varies, by age and cohort and all kinds of things. But in general, we are more stressed out. Why? That remains to be seen. I mean, this goes back to the idea that a lot of these research projects take a long time to sort of sift through. Anyone can pick their story. Well, it's political discourse is awful. Well, it's economic mobility has plummeted. Well, it's the cost of living. You can tell lots of compelling stories. And going back to your original question, you can certainly pick data to support those stories. But I think really teasing out the multiple causal reasons behind, say, kind of a heightened emotional unwellness in the United States, I would consider that an open question.
Well, let's move to 2026, which is indeed literally an open question.
Yes.
You boast that you believe in curiosity, imagination, and creativity. For you, those are the engines of the future.
Yes.
2026 still lies in the future. What would you like to happen, Andrea? I mean, I'm not going to ask you as a data scientist to predict the future because you will no doubt say that you're no better at predicting it than anyone else, anyone who does or doesn't have the data. But what would you like to happen in 2026? If we're talking again this time next year, what would you like to report in terms of shifts in the data?
I I appreciate the question, and I particularly appreciate not having to pretend to be a fortune teller. It's going to be an exciting year for Libras, I think is the headline. Um,
Mm.
I I I'm going to kind of be on brand here and say that I hope that that if we speak again this time next year, we can look back and say, "Gosh, we approached a lot of our biggest problems in the world, in the country, social problems, political problems, physical problems. We approached it with more curiosity and more empathy than we did previously." And it's very easy and rich for me to just sort of sit here, in a room, not in a conflict zone, not being actively attacked, knock on wood, and say those things. But I really think that there's a lot of space for Americans to resolve our differences, not all of our differences, but many of our differences, if we just pause and say, I wonder why the other side has the beliefs that they do, as opposed to jumping to the conclusion of, oh, they have those beliefs because they are racist, because they don't care about America, because they are mentally ill, or whatever, causal leap we want to take that's convenient for our point of view. I hope that we can come back in a year and say, we actually took a minute to approach these horrible, difficult, thorny problems with curiosity. And we said things like, I wonder why people believe this. I wonder why we can't seem to actually have a conversation. What could it take to get us to sit down and say, talk about an immigration policy that most of us feel is kind of ethically responsible? That's lofty, but I will offer that as the hope. I also hope we can approach AI with that kind of curiosity as well. I think that's a really big risk to everything in the critical thinking curiosity land.
Well, I hope AI approaches us in that way too.
Agreed.
I don't think anyone would disagree with you, Andrea. Andrea, the question is how.
Yeah.
You're also, in your history, you've been a circus performer. You're a stand-up comic too.
Yes.
Do we need to do crazy things to achieve crazy results? You know that if we improve our life, maybe we can save the world too. None of us individually can save the world, but I'm not suggesting everyone should become a circus performer or even a comedian. But do we need to think radically, so to speak, in terms of what we do and how we think of ourselves?
I mean, I think that a lot of the fuel for curiosity and for wondering about how someone came to a different set of beliefs or preferences or behaviors from me, I think to get into that mindset, it can be helpful to do things outside of our comfort zone. And that certainly doesn't have to be stand up or circus or whatever. But I think that getting out of our own regular routine, the way that I always go to work, the people that I talk to or don't talk to, and then I come home and then I read the internet and then I feel bad. I think that there's something very beautiful and powerful about doing something new, particularly something that you are bad at, and just saying like, yeah, I'm not great at this and it's not the end of the world. I think we're so afraid to be wrong and to seem silly or dumb that spills over into our mindset about the world as well. I have to be right and they have to be wrong, and I have to be good and they have to be bad. Whereas I think a simple way to sort of get out of our same, kind of echo chambers in our brain is to physically put ourselves in a room. And I'm not saying, go bowling with your greatest enemy, but I am saying, what if you spent an evening going to the roller skating rink as opposed to doom scrolling? I'm not a psychologist. This isn't therapy advice, but I have found in my own life that one of the best ways to sort of get myself out of a mindset rut or get myself out of a position of sitting and being like, why are all these other people doing these terrible things, is to just go and do something new, whatever that is. And you sort of just get to, by accident, interact with people who are a different age from you, have different views from you, have different problems in life. And I really think we cannot overstate the importance of that kind of small thing.
Wise words from Andrea. Maybe we should have a show entitled Bowling with Bin Laden.
There we go.
Fascinating conversation. Andrea Jones-Rooy. We'll have to meet again this time next year. You're a data scientist, but a very human one. Happy New Year, healthy New Year, wise New Year. Thank you very much.
Same to you, and happy everything.